Thank you, everyone, for joining us to a session about the Holocaust education, and why is it necessary to study the Holocaust? Patریشیا, why don't you go ahead?
Well, I think there are so many lessons that can be drawn from the Holocaust. The Holocaust teaches us, of course, where prejudice can lead, how lethal it can be. It teaches us that democracies are fragile things, even democracies as old and as venerable as the American experience. But I think there are some broader lessons that the Holocaust teaches that are less about the history per se, but more about the big picture lessons we can draw from this history. And I think, one, we learn not to demonize individuals who committed crimes like these under the Nazis. We can view, if you view Nazi perpetrators as monsters, this distorts our understanding of them and of the history. And their acts may be monstrous, but the people who commit those crimes were human beings, just like us. They found themselves in a set of circumstances where they had to make a choice to carry out atrocities because they had the latitude to do it, because they were compelled by peer pressure, because they believed in ideology that told them they were doing the right thing, because of greed, because of ambition. And this is a lesson we can apply in other situations. When we categorize persons as monstrous or the essence of evil, this removes the human responsibility and the element of choice from these crimes. And I think that's really important to emphasize, the element of choice. People had a choice to do as they did in these particular cases. It was to commit atrocities to help carry out the Holocaust.
Edna, what is your answer to this question?
I think it's really three things, and I endorse and echo everything Patrícia said. One is because we study this history, and we study the history of the Holocaust because we can. And we can in ways that we can't study any other event. I believe this is the best documented crime in human history with, and you've heard me say this before, with so much of the evidence left by the perpetrators themselves. So it is one of those rare events that we can study from a multiplicity of perspectives of people, their involvement, whether they were victimized, whether they were the victimizers, whether they were helpers, whether they were adjacent to it. So we can look at it in many different ways because of the documentation. The second has to do with the specifics of it and with anti-Semitism, and I don't want us to ever lose that the Nazis had a singular focus on Jewish people, and when we overly universalize this history, we can lose track of that. And so this has very potent lessons to teach us about why Jews continue to be singled out. And the third has to do with what Patrícia said about human nature, that in addition to the specifics of this particular context and these people, human nature is really immutable, that our capacity to do deeds of intense evil and also of intense good and altruism remain the same throughout time. And this shows us in very stark relief what are the possibilities along that spectrum. So those are my three reasons.
And both of you have dedicated so much of your lives to studying the Holocaust. Edna, what are the main lessons you have learned? Like, if you want to list it again, 1, 2, 3, what are the main lessons you have learned?
For me, I try to always keep it kind of in the personal. Maziar, we've known each other for many years, that my father was a survivor of the Holocaust. My grandparents were survivors. I grew up hearing about this history, but I thought it was just kind of personal and about me, my family, the severed branches and severed roots of a family tree. But over time, I came to realize that if we care at all about the kind of world that we live in now, about our societies, about how neighbors treat each other, about how our kids have responsibilities that are much bigger than themselves or bigger than achieving material success or professional success, that this is really a seminal event that enables us to see how the accumulation of many seemingly small decisions and actions can take us in directions that we may not want to go or that we may want to go. So that's really kind of abstract, but for me, it's I don't know. I'm not a person who believes in God, and so for me, the arc of the universe is determined by human beings, and so we have an obligation, I think, to be reflective and to learn from past events and to have them correct and nudge us, even if it's in ways that feel uncomfortable.
Edna and I are both alike in that, I gave this question a good hard think, because what are those lessons? Are there lessons to draw? And I think the museum talks a lot about bystanders and upstanders. Don't be a bystander. And we all say to ourselves, I could never be a perpetrator. I could never be a bystander. But for me, having studied this particular area and having more understanding, of course, as I grow older, I think there's a reckoning of how one can get drawn into things. I'm no longer so certain that I would have been a rescuer or an upstander. And I think that realization has made me more vigilant as a person, as a citizen. I also have come to believe that the veneer of civilization is really thin. In peacetime, there's civility, there's manners, there's law and order, there's respect for one's fellow man, but that can very easily go by the wayside very quickly. And that idea, that enlightenment has made me more vigilant too, and more self-inspection about what I do and what I say.
And as historians, how do you feel when someone compares an event or even a tragedy to the Holocaust, or a dictator or a tyrant to Hitler? How do you feel when someone says so-and-so is like Hitler, or this is the Holocaust in such and such country? How do you feel?
I think it's one thing to compare the Holocaust to other genocides or certain aspects of what caused the Holocaust in a careful, nuanced way, because as Edna said, we can see warning signs from the sort of the prologue that goes into the Holocaust. So in some cases, that's helpful. But I think when people compare the Holocaust or the Nazis or Hitler casually to modern events, that's a cause for concern. And we call that here in the museum playing the Nazi card, right? I think it's okay to discuss and point out similarities in a thoughtful way. And that's how we understand those warning signs that Edna talked about. That's how we understand comparisons of genocide. That's how we understand the history and what it can teach us. But playing this Nazi card is really a rhetorical device to stop that debate and the give and take discussion, and to tar and feather the object of the rancor of whoever is mentioned, whether it's a dictator or a politician or whatever being compared to Hitler. It's to stop that debate rather than to encourage it.
My reaction when people make comparisons to Nazis or Hitler, first is that it hurts. That, as I said, that someone's murdered child or murdered father or husband didn't die so that you could then just throw it around in the service of whatever political cause that we have today. That's one. The second part, though, once I get past the feeling of it stings and you're a jerk or some other rude word that I won't say here, is that either one of two things is possible. Either the person saying it is lazy, so it's just sort of an easy, it's the worst word they could think of to call someone, and they think, as Patricia said, it will just kind of shut it down. Like, I've said you're the worst possible thing, so end of story. Or more worryingly, often there is an undercurrent of something more hateful. That's when you start to verge into distortion of Holocaust history or Holocaust denial, the idea that somehow, and we see this emanating right now from Russia, for example, from Moscow, where it's saying that somehow the Holocaust is for the West, and this is in this Russian narrative, Russian government narrative, that it's some kind of sacred cow or untouchable thing for the West, or it's used as a way to attack Israel, or it's used to attack Jewish people because they know, the speaker knows that it is a sore spot or a sensitive issue. So sometimes it's invoked out of laziness or being too casual, and sometimes it has a more aggressive agenda.
Omid, go ahead.
Edna, you mentioned how the Nazis exploited the centuries of hatred. So in my society, as all of these recent protests flaring up, I see that this society is becoming highly politicized, and at the same time they are more openly expressing themselves. So you can see an immense amount of anger and dismay that is now turning into some sort of a hatred, and it creates at some point in certain groups of people, or even activists, political activists, some sort of a strong desire for revenge. How we can prevent this? How we can prevent a very hate social group to become a hateful social group that might be eventually capable of doing something really atrocious in revenge?
I think one way, and this is a way that Holocaust history and the post-war period after World War II is instructive, is to look at models of justice that have structure and legality and form to it, as opposed to just kind of free for all violence or vengeance. And I think, many of us are watching from afar, looking to Iran with great admiration and hope, especially seeing women who are walking around with their hair uncovered and free, a very daring, bold act. And seeing also how, of course, there will be feelings of anger and retribution if there ever is regime change. We recently at the museum published a handbook. This sounds very basic and mundane, but it is about post-atrocity justice, what you do exactly in societies where there are quite literally countless perpetrators, too many prison guards or killers or informers or all kinds of really degradations and fraying of society, and how do you deal with that later? And the Holocaust is a very useful example, because we have so many cases of different kinds of courts, for example. And let me tell you some that may surprise you. So there are the obvious ones that are famous, like the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg, which was a court put together by the victorious Allied forces. But that is one model, and one that has been useful and looked to directly in a place like Rwanda that had such a brutal bloodbath in just a matter of weeks, to say, how might we, in a society where it would be impossible to root out and imprison every possible complicit person because it involved so many people in our society, how do we reintegrate? How do we use courts to be about more than just trial and verdict and punishment, but also to be about healing, also to be about establishing an agreed upon historical record? For me personally, if I look at the Nuremberg trials, the significance is less about the verdicts, which are symbolic, because the defendants at the main trial were 22 defendants chosen to represent a cross-section of the areas of German society that were involved in not just the Holocaust. It was a war crimes tribunal. The Holocaust is a subset, but of waging war, of complicity of industries and business in it, of the role of journalists and media and propaganda. So all of those things. But there were also domestic trials in places to say, how do we deal with our local collaborators who went along with an occupying force? And then the last one I said I wanted to mention that might surprise you is there have been a number of trials, and this is actually part of a much older Jewish tradition of they're almost like theatrical trials, where as a form of catharsis through art, they hold a trial, and people who were victimized or who lost loved ones come and give testimony in a court that has no authority to mete out any punishment, and maybe even the so-called defendant is dead. But it's a way to kind of process, to say, we need to talk about what happened. We need testimony. We need acknowledgement, to know that victims get so much more out of their quote unquote day in court than just knowing if someone goes to prison, but also to be recognized. And then of course, there's always the question of reparations on a financial level. How do you try to make whole something that can't be replaced? Years of someone's life spent locked up in a cell. The daughter who will never come back because she was killed by police, those kinds of things. So I think that there are many, many cases, and we have a lot of case studies of this at the Holocaust Museum that show different models for how to kind of transform some of those valid feelings of fury and revenge into constructive and societally guided forms.
I want to ask you about the speech regulations when it comes to hate speech. What do you think is the most effective approach towards the type of speech that is not necessarily incitement of violence, but it is creating some sort of a hateful environment and eventually creates some sort of a highly polarized society, and that can eventually create a very hateful environment, a very dangerous environment. Do you think that just canceling speech and censoring it, or just limiting the speech and restricting it would be enough? Because in my own experience, I see that whenever the speech is restricted, it goes hidden and it creates some sort of even more attractive type of speech for some people who are more ignorant compared to others when it comes to new topics or topics which are not addressed. So do you think we should just let the society kind of solve the situation, the problem, or we should intervene and regulate more directly to prevent that type of speech?
Here in the United States, there's free speech. You're allowed to say whatever you wish. Within limits, there are certain things you can't say. For instance, like you can't induce violence and those sorts of things. You can't yell fire in a theater. But in places like Germany and Austria, until very recently, Mein Kampf was banned until very, very recently. You could not you could not own a copy of Mein Kampf, which Hitler wrote in the early 1920s before coming to power. And there were certain parts of speech, Nazi language, that was regulated. And perhaps this is necessary in a society where we talked about that before, where everyone was involved, right, in the 1940s. But where so much of the society was actually involved in the mainstream government, which was a criminal government. And so these are the two different ways that European societies seem to have handled this. And I think you're right. When you restrict it, it becomes somehow fun and dangerous. You know, it'll go underground, and I think it's a temptation for extremists then, or even non-extremists, to use these words as something daredevil, or what's the word I'm looking for, to use these terms because they're forbidden. I think what we should do so is regulation by the state a necessity? And I'm not really sure that it is. I have German relatives. My family are German Protestants, and I have German relatives still living there. So I know the two situations. And I think what's more important is for us to get involved as individuals. And when we hear hate speech, to intervene and to stand up and call the person out and say, do you really mean what you're saying there? Do you really mean what you're saying about Blacks? Do you really mean what you're saying about Arabs? Do you really mean what you're saying about Asians or Jews? Fill in the blank. I think that I think we should be vigilant in calling that out and asking the questions. What do you mean by that?
I think Patricia covered it well. I think we should be careful not to conflate someone's right to say something with an obligation to offer a platform for it. So just because you're allowed to say what you believe doesn't mean that this app has to permit it, or that I have to put it in your newspaper. When I was in college and I worked at the university newspapers, a Holocaust denier wanted to place an advertisement in the paper, and the paper refused to take it on the grounds that they didn't knowingly publish false advertising, but instead, and I can't say this with a straight face, but it's true, they took it as an opinion piece. So they wouldn't publish a factually inaccurate ad, but they felt that this man had a right to state his opinion. And I and some other people quit the paper because we said he can shout his opinion all he wants. He can make leaflets, he can mail them to people, he can scream it on the quad, but we don't have to give him a megaphone to talk about it. So I think that's the other thing. And we can lobby the places that we give our business to say, I don't want to be there if that's the kind of speech that you have.
It also have to do with the specific country, specific history of that country, the context of that type of quote unquote censorship. For example, in Germany, Nazism and Nazi speech has a different history than in the United States. Or in Iran, eventually after the demise of this government, anti-Baha'i hate speech has a different history and the cultural and historical context than in, I don't know, in Germany or in Brazil. So doesn't it have to do also with the specific country and culture and history?
Sure. But also that, as you've said already, that if an idea is tamped down too much, it becomes attractive as something subversive and can flourish in darkness. And so I think about kind of, with a toddler, when they have tantrum, they want attention. And so I think often purveyors of hate speech want attention, and they love to be called out in a public way. So I think as much as it's possible to kind of flag them or talk or shut it down quietly, that's good. But the minute that it becomes like a source of spotlight, it actually becomes even more appealing to do.
Sona, Mehrak, do you have any questions? Go ahead. Mehrak, go ahead.
I'm curious that how we can solve these problems, how we can prevent repeating these kind of things in our communities. We know that the government, like the Nazi government and also the Islamic Republic, they have power. They could do anything that they want to do against the minorities like Baha'is or Jews or everywhere. But I'm thinking that how we can have some sorts of things to maybe reduce or solve the problem.
I do have some ideas, although most of them are just me speaking to you person to person. I don't claim to have expertise in, direct conflict resolution, but having looked at a lot of this history, I think elements of it have to do with, first of all, awareness. When minorities are at risk, and the Holocaust is sort of the most extreme example, or as I said, the best documented example, that when minorities are at risk, the whole society is actually unhealthy, that it's just a symptom. So in the particular history in which I am trained, it is the Jews, but it didn't end with the Jews. And the Jews were the primary target, but that there were also many other groups that were targeted by the Nazi regime. So for different reasons, and we can go into them, but Roma and Sinti people, Jehovah's Witnesses, people with both physical and mental disabilities, gay men, that societies that have this kind of rigid approach of an in-group and an out-group tend to cause a lot of destruction and violence and misery to everyone who is determined to be on the periphery.
I was wondering what the two of you, Pатrisha and Edna, think about the global community's responsibility in the face of atrocities happening in different parts of the world. I'm just wondering what you think about the global community should do, considering the insurmountable walls of sovereignty in international law, where when there is a state in power, we can't do anything about it. So what do we do as people, not as just governments and states, but as members of just communities who are traumatized, we know what trauma is. We know what atrocities are. I can be more specific. I am actually talking about Iran. As we are watching, for example, 15,000 people arrested, 500 at least dead, school children being raped in prison, or being forced to watch pornographic materials under the guise of re-education. What do we do?
I wish I knew. I mean, the closest things that I can think of, and again, this is just based on human experience, it's not something I'm trained in, but is about, I think, human contact, human networks, making people feel that they're not alone, that the world did not forget, that the world has not gotten bored and moved on to the crisis du jour, of spreading awareness about things, and also of giving models of resilience. I mean, some of the most beautiful interactions that I've seen in my 20 plus years at the museum have been between Holocaust survivors and people who have survived or left behind families in crisis zones now. I mean, I'm thinking about like a colleague of ours who had to flee Egypt after Tahrir Square because he was Coptic, and he now works with us. And to say, like, your pain is my pain, and it's not an Olympics of suffering, and that if you can see that someone could endure something so terrible, like the murder of their entire families and the disruption of any education, and still have the optimism to bring a child into the world and laugh again and live a life, I think that also gives, I hope, strength and hope to people who are in the midst of their hell. So I think the digital world is a place where we have online and global community in a way that we didn't before. And maybe that person you were talking about, Sona, is very literal about that. I don't, the United Nations is supposed to be, but I don't think most of us feel that it is very effective, because clearly things still happen. So I would imagine through digital communities is one way, and by drawing attention to the place. Elie Wiesel quoted him at the beginning. He said, wherever there is suffering, that must be the center of our world. I'm paraphrasing. But for us to direct spotlights in a way that we can, and get allies and get ambassadors, people with big social media followings, to care about the people and places that we care about. So people see it's not just a niche thing, or it's not just for Iranians or for the Persian diaspora, but for all people of goodwill and who care about those topics, to own it as their own, and to know that they are interlinked.
So from what I'm hearing, you're talking about empathy, that one of the main thing that we can take away from Holocaust education or learning about the Holocaust is to have empathy with other people, with the suffering of other people.
But empathy, but also using our platforms, however small they are, to connect, to draw attention, to make sure that people know, to raise money for the causes that we care about when they can actually do on the ground work, to spread important news stories, to not spread the hateful one. So I think empathy is the start, Maziar, but I think it can then drive people to action.